Hi everyone! Welcome back to my channel. Today we are talking about the top 10 fantasy books with the best magic. And I'm purposely not saying magic system in this video because some of these aren't necessarily hard magic systems that I'm featuring. Some of them are softer magic, or some of them are just ways in which our characters get their powers or use their magic in certain ways. So it's not necessarily these are the best magic systems, but these are my favorite fantasy books that I've read that utilize magic in a certain way. But before we get to the books, I need to mention this video's sponsor, which is The Elementals by Abby Lattanzio. 4 lost princes, 1 corrupt uncle. Eastport, a place of former peace, has rapidly turned its back on natural power wielders known as elementals. Under the rule of domineering magistrate Rufus, elementals are subject to fates of imprisonment, death, and forced exposure to a mysterious substance known as Usgar. While the future continues to look grim for elementals, the ocean tides seem to have other plans. 4 brothers, united by royal blood and a shared goal of restoring the kingdom, must find a way to work together before it is too late. So travel to Eastport and discover the 4 types of elementals in this new book that was just released yesterday on July 11th. This sounds fantastic. I've always had a fascination with anything surrounding the 4 elements, especially magic surrounding the 4 elements. So this book sounds so good. If it sounds interesting to you, you should definitely check out. I will make sure to also link the book trailer that is now live and on YouTube that you can watch, which looks incredible, and all of the information for ordering this book will be linked down below. It's available on Amazon as a paperback, ebook, or on Barnes & Noble. So definitely go check it out. A huge thank you to Curious Curls Publishing for so kindly sponsoring today's video and allowing me to help promote the elementals. So now let's get back into the video. I'm going to try to kind of break this video up into different parts where I do talk about first the best fantasy books with magic systems, and then also talk about the best fantasy just using magic. So let's start with what I think are the best fantasy magic systems, my favorite that I've come across so far. I'm gonna go ahead and get the obvious one out of the way because I think that everyone can agree that this is kind of the most popular fantasy book magic system. It's the most well-known, I think, and that is, of course, the magic system from the Final Empire, the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. You've probably heard about this if you're familiar with fantasy books at all. Mistborn has a magic system where it is very much taking the idea of what's called allomancy and the ability for certain characters to be able to ingest certain types of metals that give them powers. And if you're a misting, that means you can only ingest one type of metal and get that power from that one type of metal. But if you're a mistborn, you can ingest all of the metals and use all of the powers that they lend. So this magic system, it's extremely hard in its magic, meaning that there's very rigid rules, there's consequences to using the magic, you only have a certain amount of time you can use the magic. There's very strict rules to using this magic in this world, and it's very much laid out to you very well by Sanderson. His writing very much makes it clear how this magic works, and it's so fascinating to see how the characters interact with the magic, how fight scenes utilize the magic. It's truly one of the most well-realized magic systems I've ever come across in any fantasy book. And you could say the same thing about several other Sanderson books, and I tried not to make this video just all Sanderson, right? It would be very easy for me to include Warbreaker in this list. It would be very easy for me to include Stormlight in this list, especially in the later books where we start to learn more and more about the magic in Stormlight. So I tried to narrow it down to only one Sanderson novel for this list so that it's not just all Sanderson books, but you can consider any of Sanderson's books, especially in the Cosmere. Like Warbreaker is another amazing magic system. Stormlight, like I mentioned, is an amazing magic system. Mistborn is definitely the one I just had to feature. It's the most obvious, but I can't have this list without talking about it. So Mistborn, if you haven't checked it out, highly recommend. It's a great place to start getting into fantasy, and even if you're a seasoned fantasy reader, I think you'd still really enjoy it. So I love Mistborn. All right, let's talk about some that maybe aren't as popular, as obvious. So the second one I have to feature for magic systems is The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart. Truly one of the most inventive and creative magic systems I've ever seen. So this story follows a society where there's an emperor, and everybody who lives in this empire has to sacrifice one of their bones to the emperor. And so you have all of these shards of bones that the emperor has collected. And our characters, the emperor and the main perspective that we follow, the emperor's daughter, they have the ability to write inscriptions on these shards of bone and place them into what are called constructs, which are essentially like these creatures made from different animal parts with these bones inside of them, and these inscriptions on the shards of bone are commands. So it's a way for the emperor to create kind of an army of constructs using the bones of his citizens to command them to do certain things. And it's so cool the way that magic is utilized in this first book. Now, the thing with this series is that magic is most prevalent in the first book, and that's why the first book in this series is by far my favorite in the series. It's not as prevalent in the latter two books in the series, but if you love fun, inventive magic systems, this is a fantastic one to check out. And the way in which the bone magic is used, there's almost certain horror elements as well. And in ways, there are certain sci-fi conversations that come up from this magic as well. Like, are these constructs human? And it kind of reminds me of conversations you could have in a sci-fi novel about AI. So it's really cool the way it bends all these different genres, and the magic kind of makes it so it's this crossover between all these different genres. It's so cool. I love the magic so much in the series. It's one of my favorite things that I've come across, and I just truly think it's so creative. I was like, the whole time I was reading it, I was like, how did the author think of such a great thing? Next magic system I have to feature is from a self-published book, and that is called Winds of Strife by U.G. Gutman. This is one that I think feels very Sanderson-esque in its magic, because you have a very hard magic system with very clear rules, and the magic is based off of emotions. So certain characters are able to kind of harness their emotions to gain certain abilities. So for example, if you feel anger and you harness anger, that gives you the ability to manipulate fire. And there's really cool kind of illustrations throughout the book that make it very clear how the magic is used. So you can see that it's laid out for you in a very easy to follow way, which I really like, because it makes it so that you don't have to be confused by the magic, and you can kind of just sit back and enjoy the way it's used by the characters. And it's also really cool to see the way it's used in fight scenes. Now, this is a book that follows a lot of very morally gray characters. So some of these characters that you're definitely kind of meant to root for, at times they're very flawed. They're making decisions that you definitely can't agree with as the reader, but they're written in a way that makes them so fascinating that I loved following them, even though some of the decisions they made were like, not the greatest. So if you like morally gray characters, if you like really cool magic systems, again, I think Winds of Strife is a fantastic one to go to for that stuff. Again, like some of these like illustrations and stuff that you have featured in the book, like that, are so cool. I just love, like, especially self-published books that put this amount of effort into the book. I just think it's so incredibly impressive. So I loved this book. I thought it was a fantastic debut. The next one I have is definitely more of a popular book, and I'm sure a lot of people think of it when they think of magic systems in fantasy, and that is The Black Prism by Brent Weeks. I love this book so much. This is definitely my favorite book in the Lightbringer series. But The Black Prism, if you aren't familiar at all, the way it uses magic is so cool. It utilizes colors, and certain characters can see certain colors and kind of make constructs from those colors and have certain abilities come from those colors. And if you're the Prism, you can use all of the colors, but some of the characters can only use 1 or 2 colors. So it's really cool the way the magic is described, the way, again, it's used in fight scenes, and the way the society is built off of this magic is so interesting. Like the Prism, the man who can utilize all colors is kind of like the high priest and the emperor of the world, and then everyone falls beneath him. And the Prism keeps all of the colors in balance. If there's an imbalance, there may be an imbalance to power and to control of the world. So it's just so cool. I love the magic so much in this series. And I also love the characters. There's a lot of other things that I love about this series, especially this first book, but the magic, you can't deny. It's really creative, it's really cool, and again, really well realized. So I highly recommend checking this one out. The last one I have that's like a hard magic system with rules and with consequences is going to be Foundry Side by Robert Jackson Bennett. I love Foundry Side so much. This is one of my favorites. And the first book, you are following a group of characters who are all kind of outcasts and have to come together to pull off a heist. So this is very much a heist story, but the magic in it is so different. It is essentially kind of like coding, like computer coding, where certain characters have the ability to hack into inanimate objects and give them commands that make them think they're doing things. So the best example, and the one that's used, I think, in the book itself, is if you hack into a wheel, you can make that wheel think that it's constantly turning so that you don't have to turn the wheel yourself. And this can help in numerous different ways. So the way you can apply this magic is really cool. And there's so many different ways to apply it, not only in fight scenes, but also just like to keep a country running or to keep things moving, to make machines work. It's so fascinating. And the magic becomes much more complex. It builds on itself in the latter books, so it continues to kind of get more and more powerful, and you see the stakes grow and grow with this magic. But in this first book, it feels like it's very much contained and it's very easy to follow, even though the concept itself is quite difficult to grasp at first. He does a really good job, the author does a really good job of making it very accessible to the reader and very easy to follow. And I just loved the way it was used. So I think that this magic, again, is one of my favorites, like all the rest of these. These are my favorite magic systems, and Foundry Side is one of my favorite books. I mean, it's great characters, it's great setting, it's great writing. It has, for me, all the things that I love in fantasy, with an amazing magic system. It's just the cherry on top. So definitely recommend Foundry Side. Okay, and then I have 2 books that are kind of more of ways in which powers are gained by characters. So it's not necessarily magic that's being used, but there's a magical element to the way these characters have been cursed with powers or gifted with powers. So the first one I have to mention is The Monsters We Defy by Leslie Penelope. This is a really interesting novel that takes place in our world in the, I think, 20s era. And it follows characters who have been cursed. You could either call it cursed or you could call it blessed with certain abilities. And the way those abilities manifest is so interesting. It takes kind of that character's soul and it manifests an ability based off of like who that character is at their core. And it's so interesting seeing the different abilities that do become manifested in these characters. It's so cool. So I loved the way that was described so much, and discovering kind of the backstory of each character and how they came into their power was really cool as well. This, at the end of the day, is a heist story, so a lot of these characters that you meet all come together to pull off a heist, kind of like Foundry Side, but this one is definitely in our world, so very much low fantasy, and it's just really well done. So if that sounds interesting to you, I would highly recommend checking out The Monsters We Defy. It wasn't my absolute favorite. There were things that I just wanted more of, like I wanted more of the characters and their development and that sort of thing. But the things that I enjoyed in this book, I really, really enjoyed. So I would still recommend this one, even though it's not my personal favorite. And then the other book I have for this category is Vicious by V.E. Schwab, one of my absolute all-time favorites. Love Vicious so much. You have characters who gain powers by experiencing certain things. And in this case, it is a near-death experience. So in this world, if characters experience something that brings them close to death, they have powers manifest in them once they are revived. And the powers that manifest are based off of that character's last thought before death, or last like fear before death. And so again, the way these powers manifest in the characters, what powers manifest in the characters, is so cool. And it's so interesting to discover with each character how that power came about. Oh my gosh, it's so good. And you're following two main characters who used to be the closest of friends in college, and they were working on this project together for their thesis that was studying near-death experiences and experimenting with near-death experiences and trying to gain these powers for themselves. And something goes horribly wrong that makes these two friends mortal enemies. And so you're following kind of two timelines, but the current timeline is following one of those main characters and him trying to get revenge on his friend. And it's so good. It's so good. I love Vicious. It's one of my absolute favorites, definitely top 5. So I can't recommend Vicious enough. It's definitely my favorite V.E. Schwab by far. And I just think it's fantastic. The characters are amazing and the powers are so cool. So go check it out. I have 2 more books that fall into a category of softer magic systems that have certain rules around them. So they're not totally soft. Like when I think of a soft magic system, I think of Lord of the Rings, because that is a world where magic just kind of exists and you don't know the extent of the magic, you don't know the limits of the magic. Gandalf kind of just has magic and you're just like, okay, yeah, sure. So you have no idea what kind of magic he has or how far he can use it. So that's a soft magic system. So these are kind of like in between. There are definitely rules, but the rules can sometimes be broken, or there's maybe loopholes to the rules, or it's not totally clear to you what the rules and limits are. You're kind of discovering that still. So the first one I have is Shadow and Bone and the entire Grishaverse by Leigh Bardugo. And this is one where, again, I think that the magic is not my favorite thing about the series, but I love it. And it has a very nostalgic place in my heart, because when I was getting back into reading, very early on, I started with the Grishaverse, and it really helped me get back into reading, get back into fantasy. So I'll always have a special place in my heart for the Grishaverse for that reason. And the world of the Grisha, in this world, Grisha are magic users, and there are different types of magic users. You only have a certain amount of types, and each magic user has one ability. There's rules to the magic, but there are certain limitations that we've yet to discover with some of the magic, and the characters are still kind of discovering what the extent of this magic really is in the world. So that's where sometimes the magic can bend, the rules can bend a little bit with this world, which I personally like. I liked kind of discovering those limits with the characters. This was one that I just found very, very easy to read, very easy to get into. It was easy to follow, and I really liked all of the characters. I liked this chosen one trope. It felt very kind of like classic cozy fantasy to me, following this chosen one as they're on this quest to defeat this big evil bad, and it just had so many things that I love so much in fantasy. So I really like the Grishaverse. I really like the magic in it. And then the last one I have to talk about is Legendborn by Tracy Deonn, and this is one that actually has not one magic system, but 2. And again, I'm kind of classifying it in this softer, not as hard magic, because I think that there are still certain things we're left to discover with the magic, and I have not read the second book yet. So things might change in the second book that would change this classification. But as of the first book, I think that this is one where you're still very much discovering the limitations, the extent of this magic in both magic systems. And there's one magic system in this particular book that I actually prefer over the other. I think there's one that's so inventive and creative and brilliant. And then there's one that feels a little bit more like tropey, classic YA fantasy. So this is one where our main character discovers this kind of hidden order of knights at this college that she attends. These characters that are in this hidden group are all descendants from King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. This book explores a lot of themes of ancestry because of that, and the way it does that is really, really interesting. So I really loved this book for like the themes of it. I really liked the main character, and I thought that the magic was so interesting, especially one of the magic systems that gets introduced. And then one last book I have that I almost forgot, and I can't believe I almost forgot it because it is my favorite of the bunch. That is going to be Age of Myth by Michael J. Sullivan. This is the first book in the Legends of the First Empire series. So actually the entire kind of Rhaeria Revelations and all of Michael J. Sullivan's books that take place in this world of Elon could count towards this list, but I just picked Legends of the First Empire because it plays with the magic in my favorite way, and this is also my favorite series that I've read from Michael J. Sullivan. It's my favorite series of all time. So I am including this in the softer magic system because, again, I don't think that there is a very hard magic system defined where we have very specific rules and limitations and consequences. But the way in which magic is used in this story is so good. I loved it. You have a character who is discovering what's called the art, and if you use the art, it means you can manipulate the world around you in certain ways. And so you could manipulate earth, you could manipulate wind, fire, water, these sorts of things. So it kind of plays with the elements and uses a certain language that the characters can learn to interact with the elements of the world around them. And only certain characters are kind of attuned to this art. And characters that do have this ability are so much some of my favorites. And I just loved the way that the magic was used so much. It never felt like it was used in a way that was like a plot convenience or a cheat in any way. It always felt like it worked with the narrative and that it very much was something that was hard to work for and took a long time to work for. And so I loved that part of it, that it never came easy. It was something that you really had to work towards and battle for. So I loved that part of it. And then I just love how you can use it as well and how it affected the story. It was so good. It was so good. It was so good. So, I mean, Legends of the First Empire is my favorite fantasy series of all time. It goes without saying. I highly recommend it. I understand why some people may not love it. And I would say that this first book doesn't go super deep into the magic. So if you're like reading this first book and you're like, Jessie, where's all the magic you were talking about? Give it a chance. This is a 6-book series, so it kind of evolves and very much becomes more of a thing later on in the series. And it's just very cool to see the progression of this magic and the way in which it continues to affect the story more and more as it continues on. So highly, highly recommend. So those are all of the fantasy books that have magic that I love. What are some of your favorites? Definitely let me know in the comments down below. And thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you'd like to, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye!